Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute. It's May 5th, 2021, and we're just 3 days now from the Schiller Institute conference, which will take place on May 8th, beginning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. in Europe. And it's an extraordinarily timely event given the way developments have taken place in the last weeks. Helga, you have been insisting that there must be more voices coming out in the West to take up this question of the danger of World War III, and we're beginning to see some motion on that. But why don't you give us a sense of what you intend to have come out of this conference?
Well, I think, it is a remarkable phenomena that there are now outside of ourselves more and more people who actually say that the situation is more dangerous today than during the height of the Cold War, which after all was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically because the difference is today there is no trust, there is no respect among the leading nuclear powers, and there are no backroom channels, the kinds of mechanism which existed even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And despite the fact that there are now more and more such individuals speaking up, there is no public discussion about that. I mean, here we are sitting on something. I give you a couple of examples, not to think that he is the most important, but Henry Kissinger, a couple of days ago, warned that the present tension between the United States and China are worse than during the Cold War, and it creates the danger that the world ends in a big Armageddon. Now, Henry Kissinger is, known that he was the adversary and opponent of my late husband for, many decades. So I don't have a too high opinion of him. But on the other side, Kissinger is somebody who does know where the monkey sleeps. And, so people better wake up and listen to him. Then Tulsi Gabbard, she had this a couple of weeks ago, an absolutely alarming interview with Tucker Carlson on Fox News, where she warned that if there is an outbreak of nuclear war, it will hit many, many cities inside the United States, and people's flesh will be burning and fall from the bones. I mean, she had a language which was quite dramatic. But then you have also, many other people, such as an Australian top general, warning that the war with China is almost unavoidable. And I think that that is really something people, for example, the head of the Russian major think tank lined up with the foreign ministry, the RIAC, Mr. Andrei Kotonov, he basically put out the same warning. So there are many people who are aware that the rising geopolitical tension, which is coming from mainly the United States, the British, NATO, is creating a situation where anything can trigger. It must not even be an intentional war. It can be just that the general tension is so high, that an accident can trigger the extinction of civilization. And unlike in the beginning of the 80s, when you had the middle range missile crisis, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the street, and even Helmut Schmidt warned of the danger of a third world war. You don't have the feeling that this is a general issue in the population. So our conference will have a couple of very renowned speakers, and hopefully, we will increase the awareness that this danger exists, and also the awareness that there are alternatives and solutions to get out of this present situation. But I think this is a extremely, critical situation, because if you look at the Taiwan situation, you look at the crisis in Ukraine, Czech Republic, Belarus, the encirclement of Russia and China, it is quite alarming.
And the first panel will largely be taken up with this question of the strategic crisis. including the question of sanctions and the war threat and how to address that. The second panel is going to take up the other aspect of the crisis, which is the economic crisis, the COVID pandemic, the famine that's spreading, and presenting solutions as opposed to merely waving arms around saying nothing can be done.
Well, before I say something to the second panel, I just want to also mention that, while all these warning voices are being, alarmed and speak out, we also have for the next 6 weeks or so the largest maneuvers, the Defender Europe 21, which will involve many countries along the Russian border. It will exercise the replacement or the shifting of large amounts of troops to the Russian border, but also maneuvers in the Indo-Pacific, including starting with Alaska. So, I think that this is a very, very dangerous period. Now, as you mentioned, this is not taking place in a vacuum, but as we have been discussing now for a very long time, that unless you take care of every single country on the planet, this pandemic is not going to go away. And I think those people who have been, really brainwashing themselves in the last year about the non-existence of the crisis, the COVID crisis, and so forth. I mean, please look at the situation in India. I mean, this is now a catastrophe of a dimension which is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, India is one of the cradles of civilization. It has 1.3 billion people. There are parts of India which are very developed, like Bangalore and Mumbai and so forth. But India is also, for many parts, still a very, very poor country. And, they are now hit with the sudden eruption of the pandemic. In February, the infection rate was 10,000 a day. Now it was over 400,000. People were burning corpses because the crematorias were completely out. There were no capacities left, so people were burning corpses outside in the field just to take care of it somehow. There are some people who are now saying that the rich countries who have been hoarding vaccines should immediately give their surplus to India. This is ridiculous. I mean, India needs something much more fundamental than even if you send millions of doses, this is not going to be enough, because what is lacking in India is the infrastructure, the health system, the hospital in the rural areas. You have some areas which are very well equipped, but you have other areas which are completely poor. And, it just makes the point we have been saying the whole time, that you need to build up a modern health system in every country, not just in Europe and the United States. You need it in Mali, in Ethiopia, in Haiti, in Peru, every single country, or else the danger is that there are mutations and the strains come back. And there is a new strain in India, which people don't yet know quite well what it exactly is. It seems to be very aggressive. It seems to go directly into the lungs. And this is why, the whole country is in a complete crisis. And this is not just India, because the head of the African CDC came out and warned that the effect of this will hit all of Africa, because most of the vaccines which arrived in Africa came from Indian productions. So in the moment when India is collapsing, this will have an immediate effect on Africa. So that just means that we have to increase our mobilization to really get people to understand that we need a new paradigm. If you just continue the way things were, having geopolitical confrontations and so on, I mean, Armageddon can happen in many ways, and one of them is to have a complete collapse into a dark age with hundreds of millions of people dying of famine and pandemic. Is a way out. We could immediately, basically say we deploy our Corps of Engineer, our, best, facilities in terms of aid organizations, catastrophe relief, and build modern hospitals like Wuhan did, building a hospital of 1,000 beds in 1 week, and do that all over the world, and then proceed from there to build modern infrastructure, develop fresh new water, because 2 billion people on the planet have no access to fresh water, electricity. All of this is urgently needed. And that is what the conference is all about. And we will have many speakers addressing this issue. Also, from our organization, the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, which is an effort to bring together people from all walks of life, all political factions, because these have to be overcome, and we have to be united to that one mission to create a world where human beings can live. And I mean, all of the human beings on this planet.
Just a quick follow-up question on this. You were reporting that there are more voices now acknowledging the danger of nuclear war. But outside of the committee that you set up, do you see more voices now urging the development of modern health care in every nation along the lines of what you're talking about? Is that becoming more of a talking point, or has that not yet reached the level that's necessary?
No, I think you have tiny such developments. Like, for example, the energy minister of India already a couple of weeks ago rejected the Great Reset by pointing to the obvious fact that that policy of the Green Deal, the Green New Deal, the Great Reset, which we call the Great Leap Backward, would prevent the development of the developing countries. This was even before this return of the COVID crisis in India occurred. And he pointed out that in, for example, Africa, 800 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. Now, if you impose the Great Reset, then that means these people will never get it, and under present conditions, they will die either of the famine or of the pandemic. So that was a beginning, but part of the purpose of this conference is to pick up on the need to do that. And the immediate trigger for this conference was the call by Cardinal Zenari, who is the Catholic cardinal in Syria, who basically said that the only way how you can have peace in Syria is through development. And he picked up on the old concept of Pope Paul VI, who already in his encyclica Populorum Progressio about the development of all people in 1967 had coined that notion, peace through development. And I think that that is the war cry which many people have to join in a louder and louder chorus around the world.
I want to come back to one other aspect of the war threat. We found this document. There are a number of documents of a similar sort, but one in particular, the RAND Corporation, which is a very influential part of the military-industrial complex in the United States, had a 2019 document which essentially was a blueprint for events that we're seeing today, including regime change in Belarus. What do you make of this?
Well, that's what people have to understand, that it's not what happens in Syria or Belarus or so forth. I mean, the Colonel Black, who some of you may know by now, had pointed to the fact that the Pentagon had 10 years before any outbreak of war in Syria a basic paper demanding regime change in Syria. This was now 20 years ago. In the same way, if you look at this paper by the RAND Corporation, they have like a catalog of 20 or so measures, which all have one aim: regime change in Russia and China. And all what you see happening right now is sort of a going through these steps and with the aim to arrive at the aim of getting rid of Putin and Xi Jinping. The Andrei Kortunov, whom I just had mentioned, said that a lot of what's going on is psychological warfare by NATO against Russia, and by the same token, naturally against China, with the aim to break the will of the government, to break the resistance of the population. And it's brutal, it is very brutal, but one has to understand that if we continue on this course, I think then there is only one outcome, and that is World War III. So people better wake up and start to discuss it, because it relates to the existence of all of us. So that means everybody has the right to have their voice heard.
A part of this regime change operation is the newest sanctions imposed against Russia, which threaten the whole financial system. The foreign ministry spokesman, Zakharova, made a very significant statement the other day about Russia and other countries looking to get outside of this system controlled by the City of London, the IMF, and Wall Street. How serious do you think this is, Helga?
One subject which is going to be discussed at this upcoming conference this coming Saturday is the illegality of sanctions. The only form of sanctions which are legitimate according to international law are those which are adopted by the UN Security Council. Any sanctions which are declared unilaterally, such as most sanctions in the world right now, are not legal, and they are really also a crime against humanity, because the aim is to topple the government. But in reality, sanctions always hit the poorest, the children, the old people, the civilians, and the hope is naturally that you inflict so much pain on these populations that they will rise up and get rid of the government which is targeted. But in the meantime, a lot of lives are being lost, and this is why this conference will also discuss why sanctions are completely illegitimate, and there has to be a public understanding that that is so. So I think that the question of sanctions, they have also a side effect, like Maria Zakharova basically said, that this leaves no other choice to the affected countries than to look for alternatives, to ditch the dollar. And, given the fact that we are sitting on a complete bubble and a financial potential blowout, with inflation rising, with derivatives being again in trouble, that such sanctions may inadvertently trigger a collapse of the system, because the affected countries have no other way than to defend themselves. And given the fragility of the financial system, that may just be the straw which breaks the camel's back.
Now, one other element of this, which I think is very significant, we'll be taking up this whole question of the Green New Deal and the completely unscientific basis for it, and the fact that it actually is not about energy or protecting the environment, but about depopulation. But one aspect of this is the emergence of the Green Party in Germany. And you mentioned a poll that came out recently that showed that people in Germany are now becoming more worried about what's going on in the United States than the supposed threat from Russia and China. Tell us about that.
Well, that's a new poll, which I find very interesting, because it sort of contradicts another poll, which supposedly gives the Green Party and Annalena Baerbock a lead over the union parties in Germany. Now, if people are worried about war coming from the United States, or security situation in the United States, well, then they better look at Annalena Baerbock, because she is a tool of exactly that dynamic. She has been part of a program of the World Economic Forum Young Leaders Program. She, was working with the German Marshall Fund, a complete, neocon aggressive think tank. She has studied at the London School of Economics, which is one of the elite universities of the British Empire. And she has announced that she wants to harden and toughen the stand against Russia and China. She's for interventionist wars according to the right to protect. So she would continue exactly what US and British policy have been since the Bush administrations, senior Bush, junior Bush, Obama. With Trump, it was a little bit interrupted, but Trump in the final analysis could not outweigh such people as Bolton and Pompeo. So, the endless wars, which, cost millions of people's of lives, she wants to continue and go in a confrontation against Russia and China. So people better wake up, because, this is a perfect tool under conditions of a breakdown of the world financial system and the effort to impose the Great Reset and try, one last effort to save the system by pumping literally tens of trillions of dollars into the green policy, which, would mean complete deindustrialization in the so-called industrialized countries, which are not so industrialized any longer, and it would mean death in the developing countries.
And one final point on this war drive. We hadn't really discussed this, but Tony Blinken was just in London, where he met with a G7 foreign ministers. They're trying to expand this to include other countries, most of which are part of the British Commonwealth. And he and Dominic Raab, the foreign minister of Britain, had a discussion about the importance of the special relationship and the need to protect the rules-based order. And then from there, he's going to Kiev, where his boss, Biden, has a long history as being a provocateur using Ukraine against Russia. So this fits into this whole perspective of the so-called rules-based order being nothing but a provocation for British geopolitics.
Yes, there is a big difference between a rules-based order and an international order based on international law. I think we have to emphasize the importance that despite shortcomings and imperfections, the UN Charter is the body of law, of international law, which must be respected. Maybe it can be improved, but it cannot be replaced by an arbitrary set of rules, where one country is setting the rules according to their supposed interest. It's not real interest, but supposed interest, and then bullying the rest of the world on that basis. So we have to discuss what should be the relation among nations. The concept of the coincidence of opposites, which will be a subject at the coming conference, is really a way of how nations can relate to each other in the interest of the other, furthering the best development of the other, and vice versa, because we have to have an order which allows civilization to survive in the long term. And that is a very important question, which is not yet decided. So you should definitely tune into this coming conference.
Well, and just once again, the conference will be this Saturday, May 8th, beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central Europe Time. And as in the last conference, you will be surprised by the variety of countries that are represented, people who are willing to work with the Schiller Institute because they see exactly what Helga's been talking about, that this is a forum for real discussion. And Helga, just to conclude with this point of the importance of this conference, there are very few venues that are not completely under the control of this transatlantic mafia, where there can be real discussion. I just put a chronology of events coming up between the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Chatham House. There are dozens of these events where they're organizing this principle of the rules-based order as a unipolar force in the world. So I assume this is why you've been so insistent that we have to have an actual venue or a forum where countries can come and speak with knowing that you can build trust as opposed to war.
Well, we have been told by many of the countries or people from the countries where we had speakers on, and also some who were not speakers, that the Schiller Institute conference format, where people can present ideas, and then you can, in a free way, exchange ideas. That this is really an institution which is unique, because it does not exist in other places. And I think that this was meant so from the beginning. The Schiller Institute was founded 37 years ago with the idea to create a think tank for statecraft. Statecraft is also something, an art which has been greatly lost, and in particular, statecraft in the image of man of Friedrich Schiller. Because we need equality in the discussion which addresses the better parts of human beings, what Schiller called the sublime, the question of thinking as a creative species, the idea of beauty, why beauty is a necessary condition of mankind, and the whole need to educate people to think in a classical way. Because also the public discourse has degenerated in such a way that everything is like a talk show format, or just some opinion where each opinion is the same, worse than the other one, while the classical method of thinking proceeds according to completely different criteria. It's based on truth seeking, it's based on the Socratic dialogue, and it is supposed to come to a conclusion according to the principles of poetical and music composition. And that is something one can study. So one more reason for you to come and join us on Saturday.
And go to the schillerinstitute.com website where you can register, you can be a participant in this. And, as Helga's been emphasizing, here's a unique opportunity to become a part of making a better history for mankind. So Helga, thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you on Saturday.
Till Saturday.